Hello, my name is Rob Hirschfeld, and I have sitting next to me today Greg Althouse. We are the co-founders on the Crowbar project, and this is part of an ongoing series of weekly meetings to help organize the Crowbar 2 design efforts. This is the design meeting. This supports discussions that are necessary for us to be able to do work in the next sprint, and we try to pre-stage topics that are relevant to design, to coding and activities that are coming up in the next couple weeks. There's a companion meeting for this, which is Thursday mornings at 8 a.m. Central Time, where we actually sit down and plan the sprint. The agenda's on the screen for how that works. And those meetings we've been trying to record them. Usually we're successful, but not always. And so I would suggest people review topics in the past for that. We also, during this meeting, use collaborative note-taking using these Etherpads. And I highly encourage participants to bring up the Crowbar Sync-In Sprint 0823. That's where we're taking notes today, and participate in the note-taking and back channel. With that, I believe we have everybody ready, and we'll get started. So, Greg, you want to start off with the merger, with the merge decision that took place, and just to get people some background on that?
Okay.
We'll talk about Thursday too a little bit.
So we realized that the development tree wasn't functional, just like the Rails 3 DB tree wasn't functional. And Fred is our kind of ongoing maintenance tree already. So to save our headache around having 15 to 21 branches to manage, it seemed like a good idea to try and at least get back to just 14. So I merged Rails 3 and DB into development, and Crowbar 2.0 work is happening on the development tree now. There may be a few changes that go into Rails 3 and DB and get merged as people get their code that was on Rails 3 and DB out and back into development. But just that's kind of where we are. The tree doesn't function as a viable Crowbar system. An admin node can be installed, but that's about it. For a lot of the framework refactoring we're doing, that's sufficient to let us get unit tests in place and other stuff. So it's kind of where it needs to be right now, but it's not usable. So unless you just want to be playing with some total bleeding edge stuff, you may want to avoid the development tree for a while.
Okay.
That's kind of what that is.
Hey, I'm sorry if people are losing the shared screen back and forth. My network is bouncing a little bit, so that's why I don't rely on IP phones for the voice. All right. You can borrow my plug if you want.
No, it's not that.
Oh, see if we actually have it. All right, I'm waiting for this to jump in. So, there are a couple of topics that we wanted to discuss, and I'll open it up to suggestions for topics and see if where we are with that. One of the topics I wanted to go through was the work we've been doing towards the API. And trying to codify some background rules for the API. And I think that's a good place to get some community input. We had talked about showing BDD, the BDD framework that I've been building up to help test the UI. I was actually going to do that as an offline recording, and so that's a lower priority for this call. But if we have time, we'll talk about testing a little bit, because we've really been investing in testing. And then the other thing we had in here was some of the core workflow and jobs. So there's a construct that Greg has been sort of banging around jobs as a sort of the actions for Barclamps, and that's another good topic for us to talk about, although it's a little premature potentially at this point. So before we launch into any of those three topics, which are the ones we're tracking in the backlog, Does anybody from the community have a topic that they'd like to bring up for discussion? Okay. You want to go ahead and kick off on that one and give us some background on what you're interested in, and then we'll roll over to APIs from there.
Yeah, that already exists. One of our guys, Chris, is updating the wiki, or is supposed to be updating the wiki with that information today, because we were answering the same question for Seth yesterday. And so the gist of it is the proposals have these things called element orders and element states. The element states is a hash of roles followed by a list of states that role is viable in. So you can use that as a method to say this role should only be applied to nodes in certain states. If you leave that out, it'll assume all. In the case of ordering of roles, there's a thing called element order, and that's a list of lists. And so the outer list is basically a sequence of steps that we're going to walk, that Crowbar framework is going to walk through. Then each element in that list is a list of roles. And so what happens is all nodes that have that role are eligible to have a Chef client run against them at for that order. So if you view it as just like a 0, 1, 2, 3 kind of 4-step through the process, those orders, those roles, those Chef client runs are done on those nodes in that order. So that way you can do stuff like Swift is an example of it. We do an element order such that we do a Swift storage node. All the Swift storage nodes get their Chef client run done. Then the Swift proxies or ring files, one of those get run. Then we do the other one, the proxy or the role, to make sure that the proxy files get put out everywhere. And then we run Chef client on all the Swift storage nodes again to make sure that they have picked up and are using the latest ring files. So I think Rob's through the share trying to find a link to...
I posted that link. I was posting another link.
Anyway, so the idea is that you can use that within a Barclamp to control during an apply what gets run when and where.
That was our exact expectation, but what we're seeing in reality doesn't match that. For example, if we do a knife roll, order concerned by that is only semi-deterministic, in so much as it's, careful not to say something that's completely untrue here. Well, if we run it before applying the proposed plan afterwards, we get different results, but those results, it's not like a complete randomization of all the recipes, like partial, so we only see the order changing within the Barclamp. So like if there's one Barclamp that has a higher priority than everything else, then we'll always be that first. But then if we have another Barclamp with 3 roles in it, then those 3 roles can appear in the naive output in the order.
Yes, that's true. The order of a application is not controlled. So what you're saying is you don't really care about how they're applied with regard to okay, I see. So your concern is not with regard to the actual execution order, but more of the order in the run list itself within a Barclamp. Okay,
Thank you.
I think about it, and I bet you're right. We do the ordering with regard to execution order, but we don't do inside of a Barclamp run list ordering. So initially Crowbar was designed such that you gave a role to a node and that was sufficient. But the way some of these more recent things have been implemented, you can have a node in multiple roles within the same Barclamp. And if those are order dependent, I bet we're not doing anything to make sure that happens in the right order.
You have to have Barclamps to manage that.
That would be a way to do it, but we should be potentially adding that as a feature.
We should.
All right, so so that is a bug or a feature or whatever. What I described still applies and is part of the problem with the Ceph deployment, but it sounds like there could be others of that Barclamp.
So is this a CB2 Crowbar 2 fix, or is this something that we retro into Fred and Betty?
It is currently will be a problem in Crowbar 2.0, and it needs to be addressed. It's usually not addressed in Crowbar 2.0. It's harder to address in Fred.
Yeah, I would. We're really trying to focus on not opening up additional changes. So, so it's not likely to be a del ad.
Yeah, that's okay. And I mean, I already had the thought that rather than just sorting on is rebuilt into the node object. It's sorted on a priority number, which at the moment only comes from the chef order in crowbar.yaml. So I had the idea that as a kind of hack just for Fred type branches and our branches that we could just incrementally if we put the index of the particular role in the element order list, extract a number from that ordering and then divide that number by say 100 and then add it to the priority, and that would give us kind of second precedent ordering, which would achieve the effect that we want, I think. That might be a workaround for Fred.
Yeah, so I guess the big question is, should the role be orderable outside of its Barclamp? So what I mean by that is, if I have, say I have Ceph and some other thing, and for example, there's a use case for this already, strangely enough, where I could have a role that represents configuring a function and then a role that represents turning on that function, and I may need to rely on another Barclamp to have run, so I want to put my config role at 100 and my activate role at 500 and make sure that like Nova, who may use Ceph but can't take advantage of it, right? Ceph can't be on until Nova's started or whatever, right? Those requirements might be, particularly around file permissions, for example. You might schedule the fixed permissions role or recipe later after Nova ran. Anyway,
it's really a dependency issue more than an ordering issue, isn't it?
No, it's an ordering issue, right? I have to configure Ceph enough to let Nova start using it, but I can't do the permissions on the files until Nova's installed.
Right, because you need the entities to grant permissions too.
No, I need the user that Nova creates to be created by the Nova Barclamp.
Right. So that's what I meant by entity.
What? Don't say that.
Okay. The user has to exist before you can grant the permissions. Yes.
So if it's just within a Barclamp, that's somewhat easy. If it's cross Barclamp, it's less so. My guess right now is I would add a attribute to the role objects that if it were missing, it would default to the order in the Crowbar YAML file. Otherwise, it would take that value for its ordering. And so then you could put whatever order you wanted in there. And then that way you could even do cross Barclamp ordering if you wanted to. So let me look at that and see how hard that is to do.
That's a good one. I'm glad we brought it up because this is a time when we can actually influence how some of those things are built. Good. Excellent.
And that would be for Fred. For Crowbar 2.0, I would do it differently.
Oh, you think you can make a small change in Fred that would do it? Okay. I'll take out the comment.
Anyway, other options.
Other topics? From outside before we jump into API design? So the topic of API design came up in several ways, predominantly by looking at our routes file and realizing that we hadn't been consistent. And so one of the things we wanted to do was to establish some patterns before we started creating new routes, so that they would be a more testable pattern and people would know what to expect.
To be fair, the things were consistent and they matched the OpenStack style of puts and posts. Rob and the rest of the team have decided that's not what we want to do and are choosing to rewrite them to match what they call a consistent RESTful path, which I agree is probably more consistent with RESTful, but opposite to what OpenStack does. So that's the basis for the Crowbar 1 Barclamp API. It is amazingly consistent. Right?
Except the places where I added to it.
The Barclamp API is consistent. The UI API is not.
Correct.
The Nodes API is not, because the Nodes API was not comprehended when the system was first created. It was added as a UI support feature.
Right.
The consistency to which Rob is talking is around those pieces being made consistent. And then the rest of the system being set to match more external RESTful operations versus the OpenStack style. So I hate the term consistent because it's not correct.
Okay. Agreed upon?
It's fine. I've said my piece, I'm done, I'll go away.
So we've been authoring this as part of the code changes in the dev guide documentation. I moved it to Etherpad so that we could do more collaborative documentation on it. It will not remain an Etherpad document. It will, after it's hardened, it will move into the dev guide where changes would come through normal Git check-ins. So do not expect changes from the Etherpad. And the actual location of that documentation is going to be moved into here. Okay. That said, here's what we're trying to accomplish. And to echo Greg's point, the Barclamps have a different API sort of pattern to them than the RESTful actions. So there's a couple things that we're talking about as core base. One of the things that's been important to me is that in the API, when we reference core objects, if they have a natural name, like nodes have a FQDN for a name, or Barclamps have a name that has a certain character restriction on it, those can be used in the API instead of having to use a database ID. Of course, the database IDs still need to work, and so that makes the API friendlier. And since we're using natural keys, the keys are already being added into the system, so performance-wise, you're going to see equal performance versus the natural key versus the database ID. Where we don't have natural IDs, this rule does not apply. I will tell you from a testing perspective, it makes the testing easier because I can create objects and then refer to them as the names rather than having to do a second pass lookup of the IDs. We're using JSON. A lot of the code that we have in there also does XML. I'm actually very close to ripping it out because I don't want people relying on XML and then getting threads back that, oh, hey, I'm trying the XML stuff and you're not supporting it. So I'm making the statement that the serialization language for us is JSON. Actually, I would like to go further and say we will remove the XML outputs. Any objections to that? Since we're not testing them, they're worse than neutral. Single objects will return simple serialization. So one of the things that I don't have as an expectation is that when you get a JSON object, you will get a deep copy of the, that you will get a deep copy of the object. So you would need to then look up the object's secondary references. So for example, if you've got groups, the list of nodes that are part of that group might be included as an array, but the actual inflated JSON objects would not be included as in the array itself. You'd have to go do a secondary lookup for that. It becomes very expensive to do that, and so I'm trying to opt that out of the API. Cross-references will use database IDs. So while we are allowing natural keys in the API, the expectation is that the API itself does not return them for you. So if you went and got a list of, I'll go back to the same thing, groups, and you got a list of all the nodes in that group, it would not show you the names of the groups, even though they were valid IDs, but it would only show you the database IDs. So we're not trying to simplify later calls by using the natural names. I'm actually I don't like this rule anymore. Some calls are shared by the UI. I don't want to have any calls. That's not true. Some calls are used by the API, used by the UI, but the API will always return JSON. And what I'm suggesting is where the patterns overlap, use UI instead of number.number. So I don't want the API calls to have to ask for JSON. I think the API should return JSON, and the UI should return HTML, and I think that it should be unambiguous as to which you're going to get. So if you're using a call that's documented for the API, it should return JSON. If you're using a call that has a similar URL to an API call, for example, node 2.0/ID, then if you wanted to use that same path for a UI call, which would make sense, instead of 2.0, it would say UI, because UI calls are not versioned. They are all bundled together, and therefore they don't have a version. So that makes it very clear that this path, while it might look like an API path, is actually a UI path. The reason why I'm making a point of this might sound like an esoteric point, but many of these routines actually are resolved by the same controller methods. So I don't want to have to create two paths for controllers to handle the same object get for, that doesn't make sense. So I want one controller method that returns HTML or JSON, but I don't want any confusion from the UI. And so it allows, and the dot format, if I don't do that, and then I have to ask you to pass either format HTML or format JSON, which I feel like is an anti-pattern. So I'd rather have the URL express the format that you're going to receive. Open to discuss that, but that pattern seems to be working for me right now, and that's what I'm recommending. So along those lines, the API calls will always include the version number. So one of the things that we've been specific about, and this is where we get into the basic contract, is that the APIs include the version number of the API call. And the objective here is to make it very clear that if we have to change the API, we can actually reversion it. There's an expectation that we might be able to have a URL that handles multiple versions, and allows backwards compatibility. But if we feel like once Crowbar 2 is out and we need to adjust an API call, we want a very clear indication that this is now API call 2.1, and then have backwards compatibility for 2.0 and allow both behaviors to be persistent. So even in the Crowbar 1 days, you'll see that we started this pattern, and I feel like it's a very helpful pattern from an API design approach. Okay. So what you'll see is there's a keyword and then 2.0. And now what we're saying is there is you can also say UI. Okay. So then that breaks us down into different types of calls. There's a list status call. So these are necessary. These really drive UI more than anything else, and AJAX calls for the UI. So there's times when we need a specialized status. So in that, the pattern would be status 2.0. The class, so status 2.0 node would return all the nodes in their current status. These are specialized methods, so they don't just return the nodes. They're going to be optimized to return short information or some additional data about that's useful for the UI. That is okay. That would be part of the contract. But the contract would be, if whatever's returned, we're going to have tests for to make sure that that's consistent so that you could depend on whatever the format is for that. And the idea is for anything that is a status call, you can get the whole list by passing in no ID, or you can get just one node by passing in the ID, or one object by passing in that object. That allows you, if you're looking at a screen like a node or a Barclamp that has status that updates on a regular basis, we don't want you to retrieve the whole list in order to find data about one thing. So the status calls are expected to take just one object as a thing. And then I don't have any examples of this yet, but I wanted to leave the opportunity to create additional filtering. So you could filter by, say, groups on status. So if you're looking at status for a group, you could pass in the group, and they would only return you the status for that group. So it's effectively a subset. Majority of the work we've been doing is around CRUD operations. So CRUD operations follow the RESTful pattern that Rails likes, with the addition, most of the Rails likes, with the addition of 2.0, or the version number in this case. And this table is really hard to read like this. And so what you'll see is pretty straightforward, right? If you're getting the base object and you do a get, you'll get a list of all the objects. If you pass in the ID, you'll get the object itself. If you want to create an object, you do a post, provide the JSON for that object, and then it'll do that. If you want to update the object, you're doing a put with the ID. If you're doing a delete, you are doing a delete. This is classic REST, not very exciting for that, but important to have documented so people have an agreement on that. The thing that's a little bit more subtle in this is where we get into the Barclamps idea, which is that we have. Go ahead.
Just a quick one.
Yeah.
It might be just me, but I see nothing but your mouse pointer move across the white screen.
Interesting. I'm going to pause and unpause. That's good. I'm glad you're telling me.
Don't know if others have the same issue. I see pretty much everything else is just fine. But I don't see the white. It's a blank screen as well.
I didn't catch that last comment.
I think you refreshed me. I'm seeing the same thing.
Did it get better?
No.
I'm trying. Let's see. How's that? Good. 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 Thank you for telling me. Are there? I've been sort of running a mile a minute. Are there any questions so far? Okay. Hopefully none of this stuff is too dramatic or crazy. That would be an anti-pattern for designing an API. We'll get to Barclamps. Barclamps took a lot more discussion, and so I'm trying to sort of breeze through this, show you how we built up to what Barclamps, the APIs for Barclamps, and then I'll let Greg talk through some of what we've been doing, and then I can take notes. So the action pattern is pretty straightforward. It's object 2.0 once again, or whatever the number is going to be, the ID of the option, and then the action that you want to take in a predicate. So the idea is that you can have, actually I'm already doing something that sort of breaks this, so I might need to adjust it. In this case, it would be, if I wanted foo to join bar, then I would say for example, the APIs I'm actually working on right now are like this. I have a group 2.0, and the group is foo, and then I want to add node bar to the group foo. And in this case, what I've been doing is I've been doing a post for that instead of saying add, because I feel like that's actually more along the lines of what the API would be. And then if you wanted to add a group, so that's adding. If you want to remove a group, you would say delete group 2.0 foo node bar. That would remove bar from group 2. That seems pretty straightforward to me. It's a little bit more subtle if you did a put, where you say foo node bar. In this case, the action that I'd envisioned for this would be moving, and this might be a place where this is not a good pattern, moving bar into group foo, and it would automatically remove it from a comparable group. And probably might be an unnecessary, because it's basically a put and delete and not very explicit from that perspective. I'm open to suggestions on this. It's not as transparent. The other option would be to say move group, move node like that, and then this would be delete node, right? And this would be add node. Open for suggestions on that. And there's a part of me that says, as long as you document what it does, then okay. Oh, and there's a get. And one of the things to note in this, and I'll jump over to here, is that as I go, I'm actually updating the documentation. So for example, there is a group API, dev guide API group, where, wow, look at you, it renders it really pretty. You actually would get, here's group CRUD read, get, here's the pattern, here's the output that you would expect, and then some details about what that is, and this actually would create, I have the new docs, I just have it for the next one. So as we add APIs, we create documentation about what that API expectation is. So while I'm a little bit ambivalent about the put in this case, I am wondering if having documentation for it compensates. I'm not getting any comments, so I'm happy with it the way I had it, and I will continue to do it.
I think that's fine. I think you need to not think about it in those terms, because your use case is okay for modifying groups, but in the case of networks, you may actually say, case, then
host
actually like
of a network.
It's a network to
green, right?
Right, /network.
Like this, blue. What would that do?
Well, first of all, you're not really, because you're using this for the Barclamps, right?
No, this is for the objects. I'm not to Barclamps yet. Barclamps are their own level of thing.
That's the problem. You're merging contexts and information that are confusing people.
Okay.
When you're talking about objects, you need to say node object or group object, which is UI. The group object, which is a UI construct only.
Okay.
And the node object potentially will be handled this way. When this Barclamps can create their own objects. And so you are mixing those. In this case, I have no idea what this would mean. In the case of the Crowbar Barclamp, where it would be Crowbar 2.0 Barclamp.
Well, so this actually here's the trick, right? This is exactly the segue, because what we're doing with Barclamps, it is different. The semantics are different, the needs are different, and so I actually have a separate section, which is the next one, just to talk about Barclamps. And I'll update the base object RESTful pieces here, and then let's talk about Barclamps.
This is still a work in progress, and so
very much.
From my perspective, the things that are described here can be normalized under the Barclamps stuff if we wanted to, but that's a different discussion.
And there are some things that should be, and there's some objects we shouldn't expose through the base like this, and we shouldn't.
For example, group objects are wholly Crowbar objects. Crowbar Barclamp.
Oh.
So technically their API should live under the Crowbar Barclamp.
I'm cool with that.
But that's a different discussion for later.
Okay. So just so people understand the back and forth Greg and I just had, and this is a classic one for us to sort of balance back and forth. Greg is very right to say that Crowbar Barclamp is a Barclamp, and I have a tendency to treat it as the UI container rather than as the Crowbar Barclamp.
I would describe it the other way, that you tend to think of the UI as this overarching thing that has no control structure to it. And it actually lives as a consequence of the Crowbar Barclamp's instantiation.
So Greg's correctly pointing out that a lot of things that I'm just treating as stuff that is in the overarching construct are really objects that could be and possibly should be managed through the Crowbar Barclamp, which is a good alternative and possibly needs to be done both ways or only one way. So people can understand that. Hopefully we're explaining that clearly enough that you can weigh in. Some people might feel that they want to have the shortcuts, which is what essentially I end up making by doing that, or if we should be stricter and have Crowbar objects referenced through the Crowbar Barclamps APIs. And I don't want to waste any more time. I want you to explain the Crowbar Barclamps API. Can you see it?
You're doing fine.
Okay. No, I can set it up for you, and you can help clarify. Actually, two voices in this is useful because I found it confusing when we went through it the first time. And that was a really good setup for it. So Crowbar in itself is a framework, and that framework is composed of modules that are interleaved called Barclamps. And the core design premise we have with Barclamps is that they are add-in modules. They're components. And so each Barclamp carries its own autonomous version. And so in building the Crowbar 2.0 API for a Barclamp, what you're really doing is you're saying I have the Crowbar 2.0 as a prefix, and then the Barclamp and the Barclamp's version are additional levels, and that's what this is trying to show in this Barclamp place, are additional levels in that API piece. So it's important to do that because if you're creating an API call or a call against a Barclamp, you need to be able to have some type of contract that what you want that Barclamp to do is supported in that version. So the idea, like any other versioning system here, is that if the Barclamp can support it backwards, when you ask for a 2.0 Barclamp, and if the Barclamp's now at 2.1, it should be able to absorb that change if it needs, and then continue to respond or fail because it now is a different version number. So that's why we felt like it was important to include the Barclamp version in the naming. So the Barclamp itself is going to be the name of the Barclamp. And then the version, which if you're familiar in deep depth of Crowbar, that actually is going to map to a controller and a service object. Well, some of these names are changing a little bit, but that's going to map to those things. And then an ID is the new concept of the configuration for that Barclamp. And so the Barclamp configurations are basically, it's a timeline for different Barclamp. For a Barclamp, a single Barclamp could be instantiated to have multiple configurations, and then that configuration would change over time, and you could move the timeline backwards or forwards for that configuration. I guess forwards and then look backwards. But we're trying to capture that within the Barclamp. So every Barclamp is going to have this base, Crowbar 2.0, Crowbar 2.0, the Barclamp name, which is going to vary by Barclamp, the version of that Barclamp, and then the configuration ID. And you want to talk about that? Did I catch that all right?
Yeah, you're fine. So the main thing is, if you're used to our proposals and active proposals, right, this is the creation of an instance of that proposal, right? So this creates a proposal, which we're now calling a configuration. Now in the past, in Crowbar 1, you would then have an active proposal that you could then go back and edit this proposal, but then apply it to make it active. For Crowbar 2.0, you have to think of it as more of this continuous stream of snapshotted instances of that configuration. So you create a configuration, and that says, I want this to be a Nova cluster, these nodes, and that's my configuration. And that configuration has an instance that represents its state over time. Whenever I make a change, I'm actually creating a copy of the old instance, making a new instance, and then when I apply, I'm actually making the new instance active, the applied one, and we build up a history of these instances over time. And so the API is now trying to reflect that timeline kind of view of change history over time, as well as the idea of I can have an active instance of this configuration, but still maybe adding and applying changes that I haven't necessarily applied yet.
Okay, and so that leads us to the next click down in the API, which is underneath the Barclamp, you would then be able to pick an instance and then specify the ID, which I've been, for clarity, saying IID, the instance ID, or as a keyword, the active, because our expectation is that when you're working against this API, you're going to be taking actions against the active one, and that is in itself an important state of the configuration. So we created a shortcut to say, pick this IID or the active one. And we're a little bit ahead of where we see we see a use case for this. We haven't coded it, obviously, but it felt right in that sort of that nomenclature. And then I thought we'd started documenting some of the actions against Barclamps, but we haven't clearly added that. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? I can pause for questions first. Oh, well, I can fix I can show the table looking pretty right here.
Right, so you can list them. You can list the.
That's not. This is just documentation. This is an example documentation table. We don't have an example of the. So you want to talk about the actions?
We haven't.
It's not there yet. You want to just talk about ideas for it, or?
We were going to have the basic operations, the CRUD operations on the Barclamp will create a configuration. Then we'll have similar CRUD operations for instances. So this is where you can create objects on the sub-object, or the sub-object on the object. And then there'll probably be a custom, not a custom, but a specific command like our apply is today that allows you to take one instance and make it into the active instance.
But Barclamps have their own verbs, right?
Some Barclamps choose to have their own verbs, and those will be represented as verbs on configurations taken against the active. So, for example, in the network Barclamp, there's additional verbs like allocate IP. The idea is that you would allocate an IP from the system, from the network configuration you specified, against the active instance. Now, some view this as a config change, others view it as a service, and so there's some question of whether or not this should actually change the instance information and some other stuff like that. This is also at a point where, in some regards, this API needs to get out of the way and let Barclamps do what they do, in the sense that the simple API we've described is useful for most of the simple Barclamps. In the case of the network Barclamp, it's maintaining its own object state. It's not a single instance, and never will be. And so there is no there would be a one-way transform to take all of the objects in the network Barclamp and store it into something that Chef, for example, will be able to instantiate on the nodes. But the idea is it won't necessarily be represented as a single JSON file anymore that you import and export. And so instances for the network Barclamp have a lot less meaning when you start adding some of these action verbs, because it's choosing to model them itself. And so that's where paying attention to how the individual Barclamps choose to present its model and its configuration will be important. So instances make perfectly fine sense for our logging system, because it's a fairly simple model. It's a single config, and so I can create an instance, and if I need to change where it logs to, I can do that through a config change to the instance. In the case of the network Barclamp, where I'm adding and removing and allocating and deallocating IPs all the time, based upon the state of other Barclamps instances, the network Barclamp is viewed as a service of which that information, while one can argue is configuration, will be stored as configuration in the network Barclamp, may not be reflected as instance data. And so that's why, in some regards, the API for these things is still in flux, because the network Barclamp is an example of the extreme end of the other side of simplicity. And so the API will handle both the simple path for default kind of Barclamps and then extensibility to either bypass it or provide some simplification path for the complex Barclamps.
And so the idea here was, we know this API is going to get torn apart and checked and changed and spindled and mutilated as we go through creating some of exposing the capabilities and service wrappings for things like the network Barclamp. We wanted to just, especially for the simple stuff where I'm just trying to build out the UI, it's, we want some rules. I want some rules so that I know what to expect and I can start testing and building tests. For some of this Barclamp stuff, it's, we need feedback. We want you to understand what we're thinking, and sort of talking it through helps create something that's understandable, right? Our big goal, and I'm just about out of time, our big goal for this is to make sure that whatever API we build is comprehensible to people who are new at the system. So it really does us no good to build API constructs that make sense to us. They really need to be externally consumable, and that's why we're taking the time to present this and encourage feedback. So what I would suggest, since we're out of time on this call, is this is not a closed topic. We can happily and will happily continue the discussion on the mailing lists. Happily reopen this discussion in future design sessions where we can be more targeted after having given this briefing. We will continue to collect topics so if you want to add topics, we've covered that one. Please add topics into the Etherpad here. I pick it up just before the next design meeting, and so that's the best way to guarantee that these topics will get covered. Our next meeting is on Thursday morning at 8, where we'll review the work that's been done in this sprint, talk about the coming sprint. As a heads up, we are doing work in Crowbar 1 on the Fred branch, and so it's likely that will be also a topic of conversation on Thursday. So if you have questions about that or interest in Crowbar 1 development efforts that are ongoing right now, we will allocate some time in that meeting for Crowbar 1 as well. Any other comments from people on the phone? I'm open to the change. Now's the time to do it.
Basically, drop the crowbar.
Well, it would go in front of all the API calls would be in front of 2.0 would be in front of the.
Yeah, that was a side effect.
One of the advantages of that is then we could actually use the resource descriptions in the route files. In some ways, it would simplify our routes because we could then scope the resource. That is fine to me. I think it's a great suggestion. It's not a big change to make, really, at this point. I'm in favor. Let me look at the impacts a little bit, but I don't see any reason not to do that. Great. All right. With that, we're out of time. Everybody, thank you for joining, and hopefully we'll see you on Thursday.